ಆತ್ಮೀಯರೇ, ಸರ್ವರಿಗೂ ಶುಭ ಸಂಜೆ, ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಅಜಿಂ ಪ್ರೇಮ್ಜಿ ವಿಶ್ವವಿದ್ಯಾಲಯ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಇವರ ವತಿಯಿಂದ ಈ ಸಾಲಿನ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಸಂಭ್ರಮ ತಿಂಗಳ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ಸರಣಿಯ 6ನೇ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಈ ಬಿ ಪಿ ವಾಡಿಯ ಸಭಾಂಗಣದಲ್ಲಿ ನೆರೆದಿದ್ದೇವೆ. ಇವತ್ತು ಒಂದು ವಿಶೇಷ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನು ಆಯೋಜಿಸಲಾಗಿದೆ. ಬಳ್ಳಾರಿಯ ಸಂಗನಕಲ್ಲು ನವಶಿಲಾಯುಗ ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ವ್ಯವಸಾಯದ ಕುರುಹುಗಳು, ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ರವಿ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಇವರಿಂದ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ಇದೆ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಭಾಸದರು ಆದಷ್ಟು ಮುಂದೆ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕಂತ ಕೋರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ಸಭಾಂಗಣದ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಇದ್ದವರು ಕೂಡ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಬರಬೇಕಾಗಿ ಇನ್ನೊಮ್ಮೆ ಕೋರಿಕೆ. ಮೊದಲಿಗೆ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ನೀಡಲಿರುವ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ರವಿ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಅವರನ್ನು ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಭಾಸದರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಮತ್ತು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನೆರೆದಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಹೃದಯರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಸವಿನಯಪೂರ್ವಕವಾಗಿ ವೇದಿಕೆಗೆ ಆಹ್ವಾನಿಸ್ತಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಸರ್, ತಾವು ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ವೇದಿಕೆ ಬರಬೇಕಾಗಿ ಕೋರಿಕೆ. ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡುವ ಮೊದಲು ಸ್ವಾಗತ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾವನೆ ಹಾಗೂ ಅತಿಥಿಗಳನ್ನು ಪರಿಚಯಿಸಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಶ್ರೀಯುತ ಎಸ್ ವಿ ಮಂಜುನಾಥ್, ಸಹ ನಿರ್ದೇಶಕರು, ಕನ್ನಡ ಉಪಕ್ರಮಗಳು, ಅಜಿಂ ಪ್ರೇಮ್ಜಿ ವಿಶ್ವವಿದ್ಯಾಲಯ ಇವರು.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಅಜಿಂ ಪ್ರೇಮ್ಜಿ ಫೌಂಡೇಶನ್ ಒಂದು 2 ಮಾತು ಅದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ನಾವು ಸುಮಾರು 25 ವರ್ಷದಿಂದ ದೇಶದ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕವನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಂತೆ. ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಶಾಲಾ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಸರ್ಕಾರಿ ಶಾಲೆಗಳನ್ನು ಸ್ಟ್ರೆಂಗ್ತನ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಬಲಪಡಿಸಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ನಿಟ್ಟಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ 13 ಜಿಲ್ಲೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ, ಬಳ್ಳಾರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಅವರು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಅಲ್ಲಿನ ಇತಿಹಾಸದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಬಳ್ಳಾರಿಯನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಂತೆ ನಾವು 13 ಜಿಲ್ಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಜೊತೆಯಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರ್ತಾನೆ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಕಳೆದ ವಾರವಷ್ಟೇ ನಮ್ಮ ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಉನ್ನತ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ವಿಶೇಷವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಶಿಪ್ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನು ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳು ಒಂದು ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅನೌನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ನೀವು ನೋಡಿರ್ಬೋದು. ದೀಪಿಕಾ ಅನ್ನುವ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಫೌಂಡೇಶನ್ ವತಿಯಿಂದ ಸುಮಾರು 38,000 ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಉನ್ನತ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣವನ್ನು ಮುಂದುವರಿಸೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಹಾಯವನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದೆ ಫೌಂಡೇಶನ್. ಈ ವರ್ಷ ಅದು ಎಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಷ ಅವರು ಓದ್ತಾರೋ ಅಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಷ ಕೂಡ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಶಿಪ್ಪು ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಇಂಪ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ವಿ. ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನದ ಬಿಸಿಯೂಟದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಪೌಷ್ಟಿಕ ಆಹಾರವನ್ನು ಕೊಡುವ ಕೆಲಸ ಕೂಡ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿದೆ. ಇದು 2 ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗಳಷ್ಟೇ, ಆದರೆ ನಾವು ಆಳವಾಗಿ ಭಾಳ ವರ್ಷಗಳಿಂದ ಈ ರೀತಿಯ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಬರ್ತಾನೇ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಇದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಾವು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲೇ ಇರೋದರಿಂದ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಜನರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಂಟಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ನಾವು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣದ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವುದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಾವು ಅದರ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ, ಕಲೆ, ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ಭಾಳ ಉನ್ನತವಾಗಿದೆ, ಸಮೃದ್ಧವಾಗಿದೆ. ಸೊ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಕೊಡುಗೆ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವ ಉದ್ದೇಶದಿಂದ ಈ ರೀತಿಯ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಬರ್ತಾಯಿದ್ವಿ. ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಸಂಭ್ರಮ ಸರಣಿ ನಡೀತಾ ಇರುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಸೊ ಆ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಬಹಳ ಮಹತ್ವಪೂರ್ಣವಾದ ಒಂದು ಭಾಷಣ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ರವಿ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಅವರು ನಮಗೆ ನೀಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸಂಗನಕಲ್ಲು ಬಳ್ಳಾರಿ ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿರುವಂಥದ್ದು, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಇರುವಂಥ ಜಾಗ. ಸೊ ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ಆ ಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿದೆ. ಮೊದಲನೇದಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಆತ್ಮೀಯವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ರವಿ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಎಲ್ಲರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಸ್ವಾಗತಿಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಸರ್, ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಈ ಭಾಷಣದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ 2 ಮಾತು. ಇದು ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಆದರೆ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಅವರು ನಮಗೆ ಸಂವಾದಕ್ಕೆ ಆ, ಕನ್ನಡ ಮತ್ತು ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಎರಡು ಮಾತಾಡಿ ವೇದಿಕೆಯನ್ನು ಅವರಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಬಿಟ್ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ. This talk will present new understandings of how agricultural economies and ritual practices took shape between 2000 and 1000 BC, centered on the Sanganakallu Kapgallu hills, just northeast of Ballari, Karnataka. It highlights the continuity from Neolithic to the Iron Age through discoveries from multidisciplinary studies and excavations. So, ಆ ಸಂಗನಕಲ್ಲು ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಮಾಡಿದಂಥ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಕವೇಷನ್ಸ್ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಡು ಬಂದಂಥ ಆ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ 1000 ಮತ್ತು 2000 ಮತ್ತು 1000 ಕ್ರಿಸ್ತಪೂರ್ವ ದಿನಮಾನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಡುಬಂದಂಥ ಕೃಷಿ ಚಟುವಟಿಕೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕುರುಹುಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅವರು ಇವತ್ತು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ರವಿ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. Ravi Kori Shettar is currently adjunct professor at National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, and also honorary director, Robert Bruce Foote, Sanganakallu Archaeological Museum, Ballari. ಇಲ್ಲಿರೋರು ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಸಂಗನಕಲ್ಲು ಮ್ಯೂಸಿಯಂ, ಆರ್ಕಿಯಾಲಜಿಕಲ್ ಮ್ಯೂಸಿಯಂ ನೋಡಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ ಖಂಡಿತ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಬಳ್ಳಾರಿಗೆ ಹೋಗಿ ಸಂಗನಕಲ್ಲು ಮ್ಯೂಸಿಯಮನ್ನು ನೋಡಬೇಕಾಗಿ ಇರುವಂಥ ಜಾಗ, ಪ್ರದೇಶ. ಅಷ್ಟು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯ ಮ್ಯೂಸಿಯಮನ್ನು ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಕೋರಿ ಶೆಟ್ಟರ್ ಅವರು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. He has served in the Department of History and Archaeology, Karnataka University, Dharwad, from 1889 to 2013. His discovery of the youngest Toba tuff, volcanic ash of Sumatra origin in peninsular river deposits, was hailed as a great discovery by the Indian press, and its significance in dating the Middle and Upper Paleolithic has brought the Indian subcontinent at the forefront of debate on the expansion of modern humans out of Africa. He is considered an expert on the outgoing out of Africa debate. He discovered a large number of prehistoric painted rock shelters in the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh, and these have led to a series of investigations on identifying suitable dating methods for rock art and understanding the non-material culture of the authors of these paintings. He is co-editor of a number of journals and magazines, mainly Quaternary Environments and Geoarchaeology of India, The Rise of Early Human Behavior in Global Context, Indian Archaeology in Retrospect, and a special issue of Quaternary International, and editor of Beyond Stone and More Stones, and third volume in 2019. The Indians, Histories of a Civilization, has been translated into many languages, Marathi, Gujarati, and Kannada. Indian Archaeology, See Current Debates, and Understanding Human Evolution are in the press. He is also on the textbook committee of the NCERT. The hallmark of his work is the successful international collaboration that has secured due place in India in current global debates on peopling of the world. He has successfully applied the public outreach archaeology as a strategy to prevent the loss of heritage and an initiative to launch heritage consciousness among inhabitants in the neighborhoods of prehistoric archaeological sites. He has excavated prehistoric sites in the Malaprabha Valley and Sanganakallu in Karnataka, and Paleolithic sites of Billasurgam Cave, Jwalapuram Rock Shelters, Palavai Ash Mound in Anantapur district, and open-air stations in the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh. I once again welcome Professor Kori Shettar, and I hand over the stage to him. Sir, over to you.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. I thank Dr. Manjunath for two things. One is he has permitted me to speak in English. Another is for this kind invitation to address a gathering in Bangalore, because as far as archaeology is concerned, Bangalore and myself are remotely connected. And I always want an opportunity to come and interact with people in Bangalore and, make sure that archaeology also reaches various levels of society and so on. and I also feel honored for this interview. I've heard of this institute for a very, very long time. I had no opportunity to come here, but I'm happy that the day has come, and I'm here with you all today. Without wasting much time, I would like to embark on the presentation here. The focus is on the Neolithic Iron Age site called Sangankallu, which is located about 7 kilometers northeast of Bellary. And it is no exaggeration if I say this is the first site ever documented as a Neolithic site way back in 1870. So there were some pre-identification days. Sorry. Okay. Yes. There are two stages in the way archaeological sites are recognized. So one is the sites are generally discovered by people in the area where the archaeological sites are located. Another is those explorers who go in search of our past and then they identified some features which are not natural but man-made, but they are not very sure what they are. So this happened with the Harappan sites, in Pakistan or any other part of northwestern India. So here again, this was the situation. And most important thing about the Sangankallu is that this is one site in Indian archaeological history which has received the highest or longest research, interest among amateurs as well as archaeologists. So since 1801, 1802, the Bellary region is known for its archaeological richness. And in between 1802 and 1870, there were a couple of stalwarts who were geologists and also civil servants working for the British government those days, were interested in exploring these sites out of curiosity, but they were not sure what they are. So we should remember the first visit of Colin Mackenzie, who was a British surveyor, and he was going all around South India in search of historical documents, kaifiyats, and also looking at some of these archaeological features which they were not sure what they could be in terms of their placement in the cultural sequence or prehistoric cultural sequence and so on. So they were very, very curious, and their eyes were also very, immaculate observations were made. And they would, if they did not understand the phenomenon, but they would also bring it to the notice of people who can throw light on what these features are and so on. So Mackenzie was one person who was also in the Bellary area in 1801, 1802. So a place called Kudathini, which is now the center place for the iron ore, iron and steel industries like Jindal, and also the Bellary Thermal Power Project is also located in that area. So he found a mound which looked unusual to him, but they did not understand what it was, and then just documented it. And he was accompanied by Kavalli, Lakshmaya, and those people. And a couple of decades later, there was one Captain Newbold who was based in Kurnool as an assistant collector. He was deputed from his service in Madras Regiment, but he was a very curious person, and also eccentric in the sense that he would not just remain in his office, but he would go into the interiors of the region wherever he was placed and look for some of these unusual things which would really throw some light on the past of the particular region. He was a geologist, but he had interest in heritage sites and so on. So he was the one who discovered the famous cave sites, which are now known as Billasargam caves, where I happened to be one of the investigators a couple of decades ago and so on. So he in 1830s discovered those caves, and Kavalli Lakshmaya had mentioned to him there are some such features in and around Bellary, and it may be of his interest to go and visit them. So that brought him to Bellary area. He went to Kudathini. He did not just visit the site and made some observations which were from the perspective of a geologist, but then he collected samples. And then he went towards this particular site called Sangankallu, which was previously known as Kuppagal, because the Sangankallu hills are capped by dark black, dolerite rocks. They are the dikes which intrude into the granitic rock mass, and they occupy the summit of the hill. So the hill was known as Kuppagal or Kappagal and so on and so forth. So when he went there, he also found similar mounds like he had seen at Kudathini, And there also, he was the first to discover the site of Sangankallu, but it was named Kupgal those days. And he collected samples from there as well as from Kudutini and sent it to Asiatic Library in Kolkata. And there it was not very clear in terms of chemical analysis. They thought that it is again natural, event which may have given rise to the formation of this mound and so on. But he did not stop there. He pursued it further and sent the samples to London for further chemical analysis and so on. So Sangankallu remains in the history of archaeological research, has remained since 1930s. And then 1870, when Robert Brucefoot, who was based in Madras as superintending geologist, we regard him as father of Indian prehistory. He was surveying the Bellary region for preparing maps of geological formations and mineral resources, metal resources, and so on. And he was already familiar with the prehistoric period of the southern India, because he is credited for the discovery of the oldest human settlement in the Indian subcontinent, which is now dated to 1.5 to 1.7 million years ago. So since 1863 to 1894, he was the one who was surveying different parts of the former Madras presidency, and when he happened to be in Bellary, there was one civil engineer by name William Fraser. So he took him to this particular hill complex, and then that was the day when Robert Brucefoot could distinctively, notice the presence of Neolithic and megalithic remains in that area. And since then, the site came to be known as Neolithic, site. And in addition to that, while he was surveying the geological formations, he also came across a large number of sites related to Neolithic period, megalithic period, and even earlier periods also. So when he prepared a document which is published by the Geological Survey of India as Memoir of the Geology of Bellary District, he had a separate chapter on the economic geology of this particular region in relation to the site of Sangankallu, which he had identified as an ancient stone axe manufacturing site. Stone axes are very directly associated with the Neolithic time period. There are hand axes which are much older in time, like the site called Athirampakkam is 1.5 million years ago settlement, which is characterized by the presence of what we call hand axes and cleavers. He was the one who had discovered the site. Similarly, he was the one who discovered the Sangankallu site, at that time Kupkal, as the largest stone axe manufacturing site. So that marked the beginning of identification phase, and investigations from then on continued to focus on some of the sites. An interesting thing that one should notice here is all those sites which he encountered during the course of his surveys were located on tops of granitic hills. They were not on the banks of rivers, small and large and so on. So this was another interesting feature. And when he was observing the surface scatter of material, not only the axis in terms of lakhs of pieces scattered on the hilltops, he also found precious, semi-precious metal stones used for making beads. And that he was even more curious, because he said these objects, which were rocks which were used for making stone beads, are not local to the granitic hill. So they must have come from a distant source, because these semi-precious stones like carnelian, jasper, agate, crystal quartz also, and then we have steatite, and those materials are not local to the granitic landscape. So he was able to, because he was a geologist, he was able to trace their provenance to the hills which are now known as Sandur Hills and so on, very famous for, also infamous for the kind of iron ore mining and destruction of the environment as a result of mining and so on. So he was able to trace their provenance, because these people had access and sufficient knowledge of these minerals, semi-precious stones occurring in these geological formations in the Sandur schist belt, whereas the site is located on Precambrian granitic Inselbergs and so on. So that is where he wrote a chapter in that Memoir of Geological Survey on the geology of Bellary district called Economic Geology. What he meant was these Neolithic people had extensive ranging habits, and they had access and knowledge of these rocks and mineral resources, not only in the vicinity of this locality, but from distant sources and so on. So that actually opened up a new chapter in understanding man-land relationships as early as 1870s and so on. And then at the end of his service with the Geological Survey of India, over a period of 28-30 years, he had discovered as many as 450 sites. And from all these sites, he had made systematic collection of antiquities, means objects made by man and have become part of the archaeological sites. And he had made a systematic collection. He didn't want to leave them behind after he retired in some backyard and so on. He made a systematic collection, catalog, and sold them to the Madras Government Museum. So they are still preserved in the Egmore Museum in Chennai. So in that particular catalog, he very clearly stated of all the districts he surveyed during the course of his 40 years of service in the Geological Survey of India, Bellary district is the richest in terms of archaeological site density and in terms of temporal context of all these archaeological sites and so on. And that was the most inspiring to many of us, and retracing his footsteps have been very, very productive, and nearly 10 to 15 PhD dissertations were carried out by following the footsteps of Robert Brucefoot in that area. So the site is known since 1870 as an archaeological site. And the concepts of that time period about identifying the cultural phase or the temporal context of the archaeological materials at a given site was based on general 3-age systems. Like we had the prehistoric past was divisible into Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, and so on. So here he was very familiar with these terms because he was not only trained in geology, but he had also exposure to Royal Society debates about human origins and so on and so forth. So he had intuitive ideas about these features, and he was very, very thorough in his understanding of the context and the type of artifacts he was identifying in archaeological context and so on. So after Robert Brucefoot initiated this kind of discussion on this site is also rich in rock art. They are known as Neolithic rock bruisings in common parlance. But then we have been looking at them from a different perspective now. But however, the rock art associated with this particular site also attracted the attention of famous explorers of the time. And then we had the civil servants, and then the person who discovered Edakallu rock art in the Wayanad area was also the person who visited Bellary, Sanganakallu, and then documented these rock art features and imageries, and then tried to understand the meaning of them and so on. But then different scholars had their own perspectives when they were going back to these sites. And Sanganakallu, as I said, was systematically excavated in the 1940s by the late B. Subbarao, who was an eminent archaeologist of his time and is well known for his book called The Personality of India, which was hailed as one of the most comprehensive account of India's past into prehistoric as well as early historic time period and so on. So he was trained by Mortimer Wheeler. He was the last British archaeologist, Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India at Brahmagiri, which is a well-known site for the Ashokan edicts. But Wheeler came to Brahmagiri because there were clues, because we had such a high density of sites all over southern India, but their chronology was not well established, not at all clear. Whereas the northern Indian sites were very well placed in a chronological sequence, including the sites belonging to Harappan civilization and early historic. There were literary sources, and then there were cross-cultural interactions with the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia and so on. So it was not difficult for placing them in a chronological order. But the enigma was the archaeological complexes all over southern India. And way back in 1920s, M.H. Krishna of the Mysore Archaeology Department had also excavated near Brahmagiri and also a neighboring site called Chandravalli. And he was for the first time in a position to establish stratigraphic sequence, demonstrate the sequence through excavations. And they were published in the Mysore Archaeological Department's reports and so on. But they were known to Mortimer Wheeler. And the problem was establishing the chronology of prehistoric southern India. So he came and excavated following the clues of M.H. Krishna, and that was the place where B. Subbarao was also trained. And Subbarao, when he enrolled himself for his PhD at Deccan College under the late Professor H.D. Sankalya, he retraced the footsteps of Robert Brucefoot as they were published in the catalogue published by the Madras Government Museum, and also the geological report of Bellary district. So he enriched the information that was earlier, documented by all these geologists and explorers and so on. And for the first time, because of his training under Wheeler and Brahmagiri, he had that model, at his disposal, the stratigraphic model. So look at the sites in terms of settlement history. Who were the first to come and settle at a particular site, whether it is Sangankallu or any other archaeological site, and how long the settlement was, occupied those people who came and first settled here, or they were replaced by another community, another cultural, community replacing these people or things like that. So this approach was very, very useful at that point of time. So he excavated Sangankallu on one of the hills. This is an area covered by 5 hills. Each of them are having their own names. But one of the hills, known as Sannarachamma Hill, was subject to excavation by B. Subbarao, and that is where he found on top of the hill huge deposit associated with human occupation. And as he was already familiar with the Neolithic, megalithic, and early historic phases of India's southern Indian prehistory, and what these phases are in terms of distinctive types of material cultural remains. Because those days, the focus was only on material cultural remains like stone tools and pottery and this kind of beads and other associated, materials which were produced from raw materials which last long even after they are discarded and buried for several thousands of years and so on. They were not aware that the archaeologists can also look at animal remains, plant remains, and several other aspects associated with human activity at any given site and so on. So the focus was on identifying the succession of material cultural remains like they were first documented by Wheeler in Brahmagiri. And so he found that this site has evidence of human occupation from the Neolithic times, so end of the Iron Age. Whereas at Brahmagiri, the sequence is beyond the Iron Age into early historic period, because as we can easily understand, there are these Ashokan edicts going back to 3rd century BC. And then following Ashokan times, we have the Shatavahanas, colonizing this area. So the stratigraphic sequence there at Brahmagiri was stone axe of the Neolithic period. Following that, you have Iron Age, where you have the introduction of iron objects into their toolkit. And these Iron Age and material remains were also associated with, for the first time, wheel-thrown bichrome pottery, that is black and red ware. Whereas in the Neolithic, we get monochrome pottery, which is handmade and so on. So this distinction was possible, and the presence of iron in the middle levels was very, very clear. And when some of these burials, which are called megaliths, which are abundant across the landscape in southern India, was also excavated, and Wheeler found black and red ware iron objects in the burials as well as in the habitation area. So that was the clue for establishing this chronology that South India has a prehistory beginning from Neolithic and continuing into Iron Age and early history and so on. Of course, pre-Neolithic cultures were also to be identified, but in this region they were not able to identify vestiges of our past, belonging to pre-Neolithic period and so on. So this Subbarao's work at Sannarachamma established that this site was occupied by early settlers who were the Neolithic people, and then they continued into Iron Age. They were not two different people or two different cultures. The same Neolithic people gradually developed through time, acquired sufficient knowledge, and also developed technology to utilize not only raw materials such as stone and varieties of earth clays for making pottery. They were also familiar with these iron ore resources, and then advanced technology reflecting on metallurgical aspects of the culture could also be identified. So Iron Age, megalithic period go together in southern India, and pre-Iron Age is the Neolithic, and the Neolithic also has development stages and so on. So the stratigraphic sequence was very, very important, and there were no methods for establishing when exactly in terms of calendrical years these kind of settlements came into existence. So till about 1950s, we did not have what is called radiocarbon dating method. In addition to radiocarbon, in the 1970s, we had one another method called thermoluminescence method, which could establish the age of pottery, which was burnt pottery, set on fire in the kilns and so on. So the burnt pottery was suitable for dating by thermoluminescence, whereas the organic remains like animal bone, human bone, and any other carbonate material associated with the cultural periods could be dated by radiocarbon. So this radiocarbon dating was not available. So that is where the stratigraphic method of dating was very, very much common. And then the surveys that were carried out along with this kind of simple excavations and arriving at some kind of a cultural sequence, what we call culture history of a site, was carried out at a number of sites. So Ganakola is not the only site in the Bellary area. Since 1940s, series of explorations were carried out across a wider geographical area. A number of sites have been discovered. So Wheeler laid the foundations for what we call culture history reconstruction of these sites across southern India, but more so in the former Madras presidency. And Bellary and neighboring districts, in the 19th century, Bellary was a much larger district than what it is today. A number of sites were subsequently discovered, and their relationships were also established on the basis of material cultural similarities, maybe pottery, maybe stone tools, maybe beads, and so on and so forth. But what was important for later archaeologists of the 20th century was, we know that Neolithic people were the first to establish village settlements. They were the first to adopt, agricultural way of life, and agriculture was characterized by domestication of select animals such as sheep, goat, cattle, and so on. And then the basic foods, like cereals, millets, and pulses, and so on. So which were those first food crops cultivated by the Neolithic people here? Because they laid the foundations for later developments in terms of expansion of agriculture, and also making it much more intensive in terms of engaging themselves in not only producing dry hardy crops, but also cereal crops, which required additional effort by human society in terms of inventing irrigation. So of course this intensive agriculture was already there in the northwestern part of India, but this was semi-arid, very dry, low rainfall area, and whether one can also introduce winter crops in this area was an issue. But this happened very, very gradually. So that is where we had no knowledge of what type of food crops were cultivated and what type of animals were first domesticated by this. Agricultural economy means this, because they were settled agriculturists. So knowledge of Neolithic was limited to identifying stone artifacts, ceramic varieties and various types, and typology, what we call various types of pots and pans, and also various types of stone tools. And these Neolithic stone tools were produced were manufactured for production of food, for food production, and also for processing food. And then you have to have a settlement located in a place which is surrounded by a perennial source of water. And very interestingly, many of these Neolithic sites are not, by the water body. They are away from any kind of, channel network, what we call in geomorphology, or rivers, seasonal rivers or even ephemeral rivers are nowhere near the Neolithic sites that are in these particular semi-arid landscapes. And they are all situated on tops of granitic hills. That was another enigma for archaeologists to understand. When they don't have immediate access to perennial water resources, how could they sustain their economy by locating their settlement on top of the hill? And then when the explorations continued in the area, they also found a kind of dichotomy. in the nature and character of these Neolithic sites. So many of them are definitely located on tops of the hills, and they are not only village settlements, but there are some features which are related to the Neolithic lifeways of those people. And this was also very well established by Robert Brucefoot way back in 1870s and 1880s, and that the Neolithic period is characterized by establishment of village settlements as well as places where cattle penning used to take place. And then cattle penning was a part of the Neolithic economy because they were pastoral and also agriculture in terms of animal keeping as part of major subsistence strategy of these people, because they were not in a position to ensure that surplus food is cultivated. So they had to depend on animal food resources as well. So they had come out of the hunting and gathering stages. So they were now in a position to settle down, cultivate food crops as well as cultivate these animals. So our point during following the initial work carried out by Subbarao and his colleagues in different parts of this area was to understand what was their economy. So we call Neolithic people were the first agriculturists, and what if we don't have any knowledge of what type of food crops they cultivated? We have no knowledge, we have incomplete knowledge of the culture systems that are operating. So it was necessary as and when new methodologies and specializations were developing, which could be incorporated into archaeological research, new insights could be obtained and so on. So as I said, till about 1970s, our knowledge of Neolithic was based on understanding different types of stone tools, both which were procurement tools, producing tools, and as well as processing tools. You see, you are cultivating food, but you are not expecting them to eat raw food and so on. So the processing was an important aspect of Neolithic subsistence economy. So you have a category of stone tools which were meant for processing food. You have a category of earthenware pottery which were also meant for processing food. It may be roasting, it may be frying, it may be boiling, it may be making a paste and so on. For all these you require containers. So multiple gaps existed in our knowledge. So as the decades progressed, newer disciplines were also contributing to a better and better understanding and what we call holistic understanding of the Neolithic cultural systems and so on. So in that particular perspective, we look at Sangankallu as one of the sites which has received the greatest attention of archaeologists, and the growth of archaeological investigations in terms of pure archaeology based on the study of material cultural remains to interdisciplinary archaeology, wherein we have archaeochemists, archaeobotanists, archaeozoologists, archaeoanthropologists, because the Neolithic settlements also revealed the presence of burial practices amongst them. It was not new to the Neolithic people, but when excavations are carried out, you also encounter human remains. So you encounter animal remains, you encounter megascopic plant remains as well. So these have to be identified. An archaeologist is trained to look at material objects, and he has been trained to classify them and try to understand the technology behind making these things and so on. But that was not enough to build up a story of the Neolithic and how they laid the foundations of later day urbanization, early historic, and so on. These are all pre-literate societies. They had no knowledge of a written language. So they were pre-literate, so we call them prehistoric societies. So in the 70s, it was possible to establish radiocarbon chronology. Otherwise, we used to say the history of human settlements begins from Neolithic, continues into Iron Age, and then into early historic period, and then later historical period, and so on. But here, with the radiocarbon chronology, it was possible to establish when exactly, whether 5000 BC or 3000 BC or whatever, it goes on like that. So this was, by the time the radiocarbon dating was available for investigations, establishing chronology, the sites which were intensively excavated across this region, suppose we look at Sanganakalu as one of the centers during the Neolithic and Iron Age, there were in a radius of 10 to 15 kilometers around this site, you have a Neolithic and Iron Age site. So hundreds of them are in a network across this vast landscape. And they were the ones which were established to procure raw materials and then bring them to one major settlement and process them into stone tools and so on. So it was absolutely right when we look at Foods observation that Sangankallu was a major Neolithic axe manufacture center. So why it was a major Neolithic axe manufacturing center, we'll gradually look at it. So with this brief background, I would like to give you a picture because now the methodologies have developed. Interdisciplinary archaeology has helped us to establish the way in which Neolithic lifeways began across the Indian subcontinent. It's a vast Indian subcontinent from Balochistan, Kirtar mountain ranges in modern-day Pakistan, western Pakistan to peninsular South India, and then towards northeast, the humid landscapes of the northeast, from Kashmir in the north to Kanyakumari. It's such a vast landscape. All across this landscape, we have large number of these sites. While pre-independence times, the North Indian archaeology was focused on excavating Harappan sites. And then at that time, it was thought that there are pre-Harappan or what we call pre-Indus civilization sites in that area. So, and then everybody thought the Indus civilization was a stimulus from outside like Mesopotamia and so on. But then the surveys and new methodologies, exploration methodologies helped us in identifying the existence of pre-Indus sites in northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, Neolithic sites in Kashmir Valley, Neolithic sites in Gujarat, in Saurashtra, in Rajasthan, and in the Ganga Valley, and so on and so forth. The focus in all these regions was on early history, whereas the surveys that were carried out since 1950s, we have been able to establish that settlement histories go beyond the Indus period and so on. So the oldest Neolithic sites that we have in the Indian subcontinent is Mehergarh on River Bolan, and until its discovery, we were not very sure whether we have a Neolithic substratum in that area or so. So the French archaeological mission to Pakistan discovered this site, and they carried out systematic study through excavations and multidisciplinary investigations helped us establish that these were the first agriculturists that lived in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, and as early as 9000 BC, comparable to the sites towards west in Southwest Asia. I will not go into that region as such, but this established the fact that transition from hunting gathering to early agricultural way of life began here in northwestern part, and then in addition to these typical material cultural remains, what was important for us is what type of food crops they cultivated. So here the archaeobotanists helped us identify the first cultivation of what we call cereals. There are three broad categories of food crops that we have amongst us: the cereals, pulses, and millets. And then in addition to that, we have oil seeds and so on. So they contribute carbohydrate, fat, and protein, and so on and so forth. So they were the ones, and which were the first crops cultivated in this part of the Indian subcontinent? It happens to be wheat and barley. When we looked at whether the nativity of these food crops, it was possible to identify that wheat was not native to the Mehergarh region. They were introduced from further west, that is what we call Southwest Asia, into this particular area. That introduction was a result of movement of pastoral communities coming from Western Asia, as hunter-gatherers. Then they were also early pastoralists. The movement, they carried with them some of these food crops. And when they settled down in this region, they gave rise to full-fledged Neolithic way of life. So the first crops that were cultivated in the Indian subcontinent happened to be these Southwest Asian cereals, and then they also domesticated cattle and sheep and goat. Amongst these three, cattle, that is the famous Indian humped bull, what we call is Jebu, is native to Balochistan region. Sheep is native to Balochistan region, but goat is not native to Indian subcontinent at all. So it was also introduced from Southwest Asia. So that is where exotic and introduced and native food crops and native animals and introduced animals could be identified. So that is where the expertise of geoarchaeologists, zooarchaeologists, and archaeobotanists were very, very important. So this established the fact that Indus civilization gradually developed from this early Neolithic stage into urban revolution, that is what we call Bronze Age civilization in this area. So that becomes the site for understanding the Neolithic beginnings in the Indian subcontinent. But when we move from the westernmost extreme of the subcontinent into inland regions, we see that the story begins much later in time. So this is the site where we have the earliest evidence, but in all other subdivisions, I will not go into greater details, the agricultural way of life began much later, at least 5,000 to 6,000 years later than the developments that took place in Mehergar. So around 2500 BC, when the first cities were being built in the Indus Valley, the first villages were coming up in other parts of the Indian subcontinent. There is a way to explain why this was temporal and spatial variation in the way in which these cultures developed, but let's focus more on Sanganakalu. So we see that by 2500 BC, we have these. But when we look at the basic food crops, we have in all the Neolithic provinces across the Indian subcontinent, we have something in common. These are the provinces where Neolithic culture began at different points of time, and our area is here. And we see that there are common factors as well as distinctive factors characterizing the Neolithic settlements in these provinces. Common is the Neolithic polished stone axes or ground stone axes, the pottery types, both handmade and later wheel made and so on. But then the food crops that were cultivated vary from region to region. This western region, we have these famous cereals like wheat and barley, and some of those other varieties which were introduced from northern Africa into this Indus territory. And then we have this Kashmir Valley where we see that initially it was wheat which was first cultivated, but earlier to wheat cultivation, Chinese millets were introduced into this area. See the small millets which we call. So there is this, for a long time we didn't know that millets were also cultivated by the Neolithic people in Kashmir. So but we know the beginnings go back to 4000 BC now. Otherwise it was only 2500 BC. So these sites are having links with the region here in Mongolia, in Central Asia and so on. These sites have links with what Southwest Asia and Iran and so on and so forth. But when it comes to this particular region, it lies between Southeast Asia on one side and Eastern Asia on another side. So Eastern Asia, early agriculture was characterized by millets and also rice, especially in China, Yangtze and Yellow River valleys. In Yellow River Valley, you have the rice cultivation. In Yangtze, you have millet cultivation. So there is a regional variation in the way in which early food crops were cultivated. So they were not isolated. There were long distance interactions were also taking place as early as Neolithic time period. So as a result, we see Chinese millets entering Kashmir Valley, we have Southwest Asian crops entering the Indian subcontinent, and then the rice is one major cereal crop in whole of India now, but it was largely limited to northeastern part, eastern part of the Ganga basin, and the rice was first cultivated there, and then later it was introduced into other regions and so on. But it did not happen at one and the same time. So we have time difference, in the way in which these food crops, were getting introduced, and then also they were not also coming into this particular area. Local crops were also going out of the area and so on. So cattle is very common in all these sites. And cattle is native to India, and archaeobotanists, archaeozoologists think that there are three centers where native cattle lived, and one is where the Balochistan region, another is central India, and possibly in southern India, the wild cattle also lived. But so far in the archaeological context, we have not found any evidence of, wild cattle. Because in archaeology, if we have to establish that it's a local, element was developed into a domesticated element, we have to trace the changes from wild morphology to domesticated morphology. It is the case with the food grains also. So if in any area, if there are agricultural settlements, the most important requirement is availability of suitable wild grasses, wild grains, across the landscape. Then only it is possible to transition into an agricultural way of life. Otherwise, you are simply gathering wild seeds and so on. So that is most important for us to trace the provenance of various types of food crops. You have not only cereals as part of the economy, you have pulses and also millets. So it is the northwestern region dominated by West Asian cereals, eastern India dominated by local rice, which extends into China and then Southeast Asia because the primary area of rice cultivation. But what was happening in all these areas? So this is a semi-arid, dry, low and rainfall area. Only hardy crops can be cultivated. Cereals are winter crops. They require low soil, low soil temperatures, high moisture content in the soil. Then only they can be cultivated. So whereas millets, they are hardy crops, and there are two broad categories of millets. One is large millets like sorghum and ragi, and small millets that we all know, naune, harka, bargu, and so on and so forth. There are many of them wild, occurring in the wild here even today. During rainy season, some on the margins of hills, you see grasses yielding some of these millets and so on, but they are now considered inferior food crops. But then we have come to realize that they are the major food crops in the context of the climatic regimes, changing conditions, and also the health benefits of eating millets. So 2 years ago we celebrated International Year of the Millets and so on. So they are coming back, but then at one point of time these millets were considered inferior to the cereals like wheat, barley, rice and so on. But we see that in the archaeological record. When these crops were introduced into these areas, millets go to the background. And very little evidence comes from contexts in which rice and cereals like wheat and barley occur. We don't come across evidence of small millets. So India subcontinent is known for semi-arid grasses which have small millets. Whereas the larger millets such as sorghum and ragi, they come from North, Africa. They are also not native to India. So wheat and barley and also bajra, that is what we call sajje, is not of Indian origin, along with sorghum, that is jowar and ragi as well. So there were cultural processes which were facilitating introduction of these suitable crops into the environments where they could be adopted for agriculture. So this introduction took place, during the course of last 5,000 years, So that, whereas some of the animals like goat was also introduced, and goat is the most adaptive animal, grass-eating animal that we know, where they can live in harsher climatic zones as well. Sheep and goat, very adaptive, cattle, also native to this area. So that is one thing that we have to understand their requirements. So when you domesticate these selected animals, we have to ensure that under captivity they are provided with their essential requirements. So that is how we begin to look at the archaeological record and try to understand the time and space relationship in terms of these food crops that were cultivated during the last 5 to 7,000 years BC and so on, and then look at what was happening. As I said, the work of Food, Wheeler, and then Subbarao and his colleagues, and including my teacher generation, which they extended their work into this area, they were able to identify potential Neolithic and Iron Age sites in the Bellary region. As I said, every 3 or 4 kilometers in the radius of Sanganakal, we have a Neolithic site and a megalithic site and so on. So these sites were subject to excavation. And those were the days when we did not have radiocarbon dating. Those were the days when we did not have specialists like archaeobotanists to help us what were the food crops cultivated. So when we talk of agriculture, we have to think in terms of two groups of cultural elements like animals which were domesticated and early food crops that were cultivated. So this adds to our knowledge of the Neolithic cultural systems and their lifeways. And then in terms of developing network among these settlements. So why there was a network of Neolithic settlements? So it is not that Neolithic was dependent, was limited to producing foods, but also they were processing foods. In order to produce, you have a different set of stone tools. In order to process, you have different set of stone tools, and also earthenware pots, which the oldest earthenware pots in India go back to 7 or 8,000 BC. But then in the Neolithic context here, we get them dating back to about 3,000 BC or so. So in southern India, the Neolithic beginnings do not go back beyond 3000 BC. That is the limitation imposed by archaeological investigations that has been carried out across a network of sites and the dating methods that have been applied. Maybe there are sites which are yet to be discovered and investigated, and which may take back the beginnings of Neolithic to even 4000 BC, like it happened in Kashmir Valley and so on. So this is the region which I am talking about, where the interior, the middle part of the Deccan Peninsula, extending from the Krishna Basin in the north to Kaveri Basin in the south, and then Western Ghats and then Eastern Ghats. So this particular region is rich in a distribution, spatial distribution of various Neolithic sites. And each of these Neolithic sites have their own long-term histories in terms of settlement histories, beginning with Neolithic, and many of them continue into the early historic, but quite a few small sites are limited to occupation only during the Neolithic or during the Iron Age and so on. So large number of sites are known in this area. And this is the heartland of Neolithic, what we call Neolithic province, southern Neolithic province, because we can broadly divide the Neolithic provinces into southern Neolithic, eastern Neolithic, northwestern Neolithic, northern Neolithic, and so on and so forth. So here, these three states, there is a distribution which has been catalogued in terms of number of sites, where we know that the highest number of sites are located in the central part of southern Deccan region, this modern southwestern part of Andhra Pradesh and eastern districts of Karnataka from Bidar to, Bellary and Chitradurga and so on. Further south, what we see is there is a sparse distribution of these Neolithic sites. But eastwards, if you go beyond this central road, we enter into what we call Kadapa Basin in Andhra Pradesh. And there is also a category of Neolithic sites, but they are not the older sites like we have here. Even within this region, we have not been able to find the site which helps us understand the transition from hunting gathering to early agricultural way of life. Yet, the investigations have been very, very modern in the last couple of decades, and we have multidisciplinary investigations contributing to understanding not only the culture system, but also the context in which archaeological sites are located in terms of climatic background, in terms of geomorphological background, and to understand why the settlements were located on tops of hills. Because if you stand on top of any of these hills, you will see that there is not a single stream flowing in the region of that, when I'll show you a slide later. So this is that what we call the Maidan region, where semi-arid grasslands. We have a dense concentration of these early food-producing, agricultural settlements distributed across this area. Beyond this, we have certainly prehistoric sites, but they are of a different nature, which is not of our concern today. So the semi-aridity is governed by the way in which rainfall distribution takes place, and this particular zone, what you see, is the rain shadow region in whole of India, and then there is this environmental connectivity has also helped us in identifying where these millets come from, whether they are local or they came from further north and so on. So this is ongoing research which is throwing light that some of the millets were brought from this particular region east of the Aravalis into southern India, western India, and then they were systematically domesticated and so on, but not in the early phases of agricultural evolution here. So the kind of deciduous forests in the Sandur, schist belt area, which receives higher rainfall, and this dense greenery that we see here is important for us because even as you go back in time, this was less disturbed by unlike the modern day human interference into this area. So there was a great diversity of not only these tree crops, but also grasses which were yielding millets and pulses and so on. So this is necessary for us to understand the context in which these sites are located. So some of these hills were major sources of grasses yielding pulses and so on. So deciduous forests, there were forest food resources which were also procured by these people. And then there are some trees which were meant for fuel purposes. So that we get in the form of charcoal in the archaeological site. And that helps us in getting a radiocarbon date and also identifying what type of trees were cultivated or growing in the region when Neolithic people settled in this area and so on. So this is the nature. So this is the region where we have wild pulses like black gram and then green gram and so on. And also this Huruli, it's called horse gram, sorry. So these are pulses which are native to this land, and some of the forest margins were the potential areas for finding wild pulses growing in the area and so on. And then the scrub jungle, now it is more or less modern in terms of its introduction into this area, but then this kind of landscape was facilitating the greenery during the post-monsoon season as well. When human demographic was not interfering with the natural systems, they were much more denser and so on. So looking at these hills and then the present greenery associated with these hills, and then looking at the sites which are located on tops of the hills, it was necessary for us to understand why the settlements were located on tops of the hills. Where were these people cultivating their food grains? Where were they penning their cattle, sheep, goat, and so on? So this is part of the culture system associated with Neolithic way of life. And then you have that kind of parkland, forest ecosystems in different parts. So there is a diversity in the way in which vegetation density, varies from western part to, to interior parts of southern India. Whether you look at it from the Western Ghats point of view or look at it from the Eastern Ghats point of view, this network of ecosystems, prevails even today. But in the past, the contexts were much more, very, very different from, but then denser in terms of diversity of plants and so on. So this region, you see is number of dots here, and each of these dots has its own legend. So we have the triangle, we have the square, and then the circle. Then we have the radiocarbon dates. So in the 70s onwards, we began to revisit these sites, and I established the chronology of development of settled agricultural way of life. So we have the oldest site now going back to 2500 BC, but in recent years, in the last decade, we have few more dates which take back the age of Neolithic beginnings to 3000 BC also. As I said, we are still looking for older sites, and we are also looking at the potential areas, regions where we can organize systematic survey and carry out excavations and establish a chronology which will take the Neolithic beginnings to earlier than 3000 BC, because it's not easy to agree with the situation that we have earlier beginnings in other parts of India and late beginnings here. Of course, it is not a surprise, but then there is a chance that these sites were even older, the transitions were older, because we are, as I said, we have not traced the transition from wild morphology to domesticated morphology in the cattle perhaps. We know sheep and goat were introduced, and this introduction was by pastoral movements from the northwest. But the local, wild cattle, if it was subject to domestication, we have to see in archaeological record transition from wild morphology to domesticated morphology. And same is the case with wild food grains and domesticated food grains. And now we have AMS dating, which helps us date exactly when this particular grain was cultivated. So AMS, accelerator mass spectrometric date, is helping us. Suppose we get the grain of, tur dal, we can date that grain. We get the preservation of these food grains because when the processing was going on, some of the grains were excessively burnt. When they are burnt excessively, they developed a carbon coat. We call it shell, it's shell. That shell protects the grain from further decay for thousands of years. If it's a pure grain, it decomposes very quickly. So we are not looking for the grains which are fresh, in terms of their harvesting and then getting into the soil. Because once they are buried in the soil, fresh grains get completely decomposed, and there is no trace of them. But the processing methods were helpful for archaeologists, and they left behind these charred grains which were discarded from being consumed and so on. So through archaeobotanical field methods, we recover them from archaeological soils and then subject them to identification and understanding what type of food grains, when they were first introduced, when they were first cultivated locally, and things like that. So these are the zones that we have. This zone is Western zone and the Eastern zone. This zone we have sites ranging in time from 3000 BC and maybe older, but I'll not commit right now. But later on we see the expansion into eastern part and then go down towards the northern plains of Tamil Nadu. And here the sites are not older than about 1900 BC. We suspect they are older here, older than 3000, And here, the movement of Neolithic expansion was little late, and then gradually they moved south. So agricultural origins is, has spatial variation and temporal variation as well. But however, they laid the basis of later, Iron Age and early historic transitions and so on. So the site of Sanganakalu is a complex of 5 large hills. They are known since the time of the British archaeologists and geologists working here. So this is the large hill, which is also known as Peacock Hill and Hiregudda and so on, and then these 5 hills. Supparao excavated here, and then later excavations were carried out by Deccan College in Pune, and then in the last 25 years, my team has been working here, and we continue to work here because the site is threatened by granite mining activity. We campaigned for stopping mining activity. We were successful. And as a result of our campaign, the Deputy Commissioner of Bellary was very, very encouraging. He gave us a building to establish a museum, and we are projecting the importance of these sites, not only Sanganakalu, all related sites, and all materials which we had collected through excavation and exploration are brought to this museum. And as Robert Brucefoot did, we tried to emulate him, and we have systematically catalogued. Now we have an MOU with IIT Gandhinagar, with Sharma Center in Chennai. All of these experts, in various aspects of archaeological research have been working in our museum, having access to the collections we have in the museum and so on. So we are enriching our knowledge through modern day, investigations, and also the methods that are now very, very well advanced, for getting newer insights into these time periods and so on. So this is the kind of mining activity which was going and destroying the entire. So you can see the hills are surrounded by plains. So vast rolling plain, and not a single stream flowing in that area. But we have such a dense occurrence of the settlements on tops of these hills. And then we have this particular band which is called Dolerite Dike, which is an intrusion into the granite, and that was the major source for producing what we call Neolithic stone axes. And the factory which was first identified by Foot is associated with this, Dolerite Dike in that area. And lakhs of Neolithic stone axes were produced. And they were produced during the, the end phase of the Neolithic or the beginning of the Iron Age. And it also helps us think in terms of why such surplus was generated. It was not only the pottery, not only the stone tools which were produced in surplus, but also pottery was produced in surplus. And the surplus could be generated because of the wheel that was used for making pottery. Earlier stages, it was all handmade. So the production is very, very slow. Whereas here, when the wheel comes in, you have a lot of efficiency. So surplus generation, we see in the material remains. And why surplus? Surplus is to, make sure the network of settlements in the region are made available. And that is a network of exchange or even trade. That is one possibility. And we also see small implements which were made from exotic raw materials like chert, jasper, agate, and so on. And we said Foot was the first person to think in terms of provenancing the semi-precious stones to geological formations in Sondur area and so on. So these sites were investigated by us when we first went there because we had no knowledge of what food crops were cultivated. So we launched a campaign to visit nearly 40 sites distributed between Eastern and Western Ghats. Among all the sites visited, this was the most potential to investigate in terms of, because of the research history at the site and because of the gaps in our knowledge of the Neolithic. So we launched a very systematic international collaboration launched here, and we have been able to reconstruct the Neolithic way of life. And so what we see here is, there is no source of water in the form of a network of streams. So where did these people had access to water? So we had to look at what we call paleogeomorphology or paleogeography. Understand the context in which the site was established 5,000 years ago. And when we understand the landscape development during the last 5,000 years, we had several geomorphic features which gave us clues to the presence of springs, all along the sides of the hill. Why there were springs were here is because in the granite, you have the dolerite intruding and building a dam wall for the underground water flow. So the surface water flows from higher level to lower level, whereas the underground water flows from lower level to higher level. So when it rises from the, in the subsurface area, what happens is the flow is obstructed by this dolerite dike, and that facilitates in the lateral movement of water through cracks and fissures in this area, and then springs become, very active. So we saw that when we did very close observations of various crevices and fissures, we found that when the water levels were receding, table was receding, the carbonate content in the water was precipitating into these fissures and cracks. So that was the best evidence to explain why the sites were located on top. And this gravity flow of water later in time, around 1800, 1900 BC, were utilized for introducing winter crops, which I will show gradually. So this is the nature of landscape here. The destruction that was going on in the 90s, but then we are happy that we could stop this and then develop the site, protect the site, and then even today we operate there as public outreach archaeologists, and then it's getting prominence in terms of importance, heritage, value, and then it's not only Sanganakal, all related sites are now getting attention. Brahmagiri is again reinvestigated by an international team along with archaeological survey. We have been working, and our collections from this site is also being investigated in the museum and in the laboratories and so on. So these sites were revisited, and first thing we did was to document digitally. We call it total station survey, and every archaeological feature was placed into that digital map. So we have, if we were not successful in stopping mining, we would have the information available in the digital maps and so on. But anyway, we were fortunate. And what we see on hilltop is the house floors and post holes. They were building wattle and daub huts, and then the horse were there, and then other structures. Of course, this is excavated. A very small area is shown in this area. Then we have these kind of outcrops on the surface. We have the paintings as well as bruisings, preserved in the area. And because that also was being subject to quarrying, part of the paintings have been destroyed, but partially preserved, but other parts of the boulder still retain some paintings and so on. And on top of the hill, you have these bedrock, hilltop bedrock, and you have these hollows. And these are concavities on the bedrock, which were meant for processing grains as well as polishing the stone axes, which were produced. And dolerite pieces, which were utilized for making stone axes, some of them are unfinished, they were discarded, and the finished ones were taken out of the site for distribution and a network. And then the Iron Age burials, we call them megaliths, stone structures, even on top of the hill. And then surrounding the hills, there were, between Bellary and Sanganakalu, there were a large number of, megalithic monuments, and they have all been lost because of the expansion of the settlements and the villagers taking the megalithic slabs for, domestic purposes and so on. So we have access to these kind of features preserved in this site. And then collection of these various types of beads, first noticed by Robert Brucewood, but then we know we have these multiple types of stone beads which were manufactured during the Neolithic and early Iron Age in this particular site. And the source of this is not local at all. They have come from a distance of 20 to 30 kilometers, even beyond. And then we have this kind of stone axe, which is not polished as yet, but one good example of the geometry of the tool is a triangular point and then the broad butt. This is the working edge. When polished, it becomes a beautiful axe like modern day iron axes. And then this is the butt end, and this is sometimes hand-held as well as hafted into a stick and utilized. And then the ceramic types. This is one example of a redware and so on. And in addition, at a point of time, we also come across copper. Copper sources are there in the Sandur mines, and even today in the foothill areas of Sandur mines, outskirts of Sandur, we have evidence of ancient copper workings. Foote noticed them for the first time. So copper was available in the metal form here in this area. Sometimes it is occurring as ore called gelina and so on. But directly copper was available, so they made use of them. And as you could see, some precious metal pieces as well. And schist belts are rich in, like Kolar schist belt and Hatti schist belt. Smaller schist belts also contained gold resources, and they had access to it. They had knowledge of their presence in these geological formations as well. And then the black and redware, what I said, burnt pottery, wheel-made pottery, deluxe kind of a thing, black and redware, and then redware, and so different types of ceramic pottery, pots and pans, have also been found. In addition to these dominant ones, we also have handmade pottery as well. So it helps us to understand there was a section in the Neolithic community which was engaged in producing these multiple types of materials, artifacts, what we call bead manufacturing activity, pottery manufacturing activity, and then you have agricultural activity, domesticating cattle, sheep, and so on, and then you're also cultivating food. Where were they cultivating? So when the springs were active throughout the year, the foothill areas were swampy. A lot of water used to come and collect down, and then there were these pools and ponds, which are now non-existent because the landscape modification because of agriculture. But we as archaeologists can notice the presence of something happened. Disconnect.
Yeah, it's gone. So these, yeah.
Right. Thanks. Sorry, I'm taking more time. Can I go on? Okay. So the source of dolerite, which was meant for making stone axes and so on, you see some of them finished one and so on. That it was a factory is established by the evidence of these grinding grooves where edges were ground, and then the waste products deposited on top of the hill, and then the axes, stone axes, some of them are well finished, some of them are damaged, so they were discarded and they're still found on the site itself. And microliths were produced in some of these rock shelter areas from quartz rock, which occurs all over this landscape. And then, as I said, the springs were active. They were, running down and then collecting water here. What you see is black soils here and there. And these black soils in a landscapes dominated by yellow calcareous soils is a clear indication that there were ponds in the past. So that ponded environments were all around these hills. And so perennial source of water in the form of springs and also in the form of pools and so on, where they could have this water buffalo and several other domesticated animals grazing around and so on. And then we excavated, collected samples from these excavations, which were first excavated in the 40s, reopened them, collected samples at very close intervals, subjected them to field analysis in terms of flotation and so on, and we were able to look at the presence of these organic materials, microscopic as well as megascopic animal remains as well as the plant remains and so on. So that this was a major axe factory was indicated by this particular circle of stones, and in the center of this we have waste products along with finished stone cells and so on. And they can look at this, the deep grooves. That particular boulder of granite has been subject to intensive, use for grinding the edges of the stone axes and so on. So each of these circle that we see on top of the hill gives us an idea that there were series of workshops, and there were also circular huts associated with this particular structure. A corner of this building, this particular structure, gave charcoal, and that helped us establish that these workshops were around 1400, 1300 BC or so. So before excavation, this was the nature of the circle, and when we excavated this kind of deposits, which I showed you previously, and then some of the blocks where we have the grooves for grinding edges, and the tip of the axes were rounded in these cupules and so on. So the dolerite was procured, and then subject to removing the outer skin, then giving it triangular form, then grinding, initiated, and then intensity of grinding finally results in the formation of a well-made, polished, Neolithic stone axe. So these are the surfaces, what we call bedrock mortars. Some of them are used for grinding the entire surfaces, both surfaces of the axe, or also grinding the grains, the processing grain as well as polishing the axes and so on. These are close-up of the grooves where the edges were ground, and the soils collected from the excavated areas, were subject to what we call flotation. All the light material, when you churn this collected habitation soil in a bucket of water, the light material floats, the plant material is light, and so when we sieve it into a nylon, sieves, hundreds of them collected, and several quintals of the soil were processed in the field itself. They were collected, the flots were collected, and then when dried, they were taken to laboratory for identifying, what is preserved in that and so on. So the radiocarbon dating facilitated us in establishing the chronology that it is not earlier than 2100 BC or so. And from 2100 BC to till the beginning of historical period, the settlements continued in some areas, and settlements were abandoned after the Iron Age and so on in the early historic period. Same story from all the hills. And then the most most important part of this landscape is the rock art associated with the granitic. And what are the imageries that we come across? So we see that the more frequent presence of this humped bull. It was a deified animal right from 15,000 years ago in Southwest Asia, and it was a male fertility deity associated with the mother goddess. And this combination is seen in a number of Neolithic sites in Southwest Asia as well as in in the Indian subcontinent, not in the form of rock art, but in the form of terracotta images and figurines and so on. So this particular production center clearly establishes the relationship between rituals that were performed to ensure productivity and high rate of productivity taking place on the hills. So this rock art is associated with stone axe factory, which I showed in the previous slides and so on. So nearly 2,000 elements occur on these boulders on top of the hill, the large hill which I showed, and the humped bull dominates among all the imageries. I'll not go into the details of ritual activity, and these are called blocks, which we call them ringing stones, like modern day bells that we have in our temples. These ringing stones are directly associated with the rock art bull imageries. So there is an articulation between this feature and the imageries like bull and all that. And we have to also look at human depictions associated with this landscape performing certain rituals as well. So we come across these, and the soils which were analyzed for recovering botanical remains gave us consistently among nearly 40 sites I said in the beginning, and nearly 23 sites with Sanganakalu giving us very good control in terms of stratigraphy and dating and so on, that we found that at all these sites, the first crops that were cultivated by the Neolithic people were the two millets. This is Saltaria verticillata and then Brachiaria ramasa. So this is brown top millet is baragu, and then you have navane, and then horse gram, and then what we have is moong dal, very common. Little later in time, we get black gram, udid also introduced, which are all native South Indian crops. That is what is the emphasis here. And these are herbarium samples of those two. Cultivation based on peninsular domestication. We have these two pulses and two millets which were cultivated. They are all native small millets. Till about 1900 BC, we do not have evidence of wheat and barley or even rice introduced into this area. And by about 1900 BC, we see wheat and barley coming from north, and the hill slopes were terraced, and these spring waters were diverted into these small terraces where small scale cultivation of winter wheat and barley, because as I said, they are winter crops any part of the world. And then they were directly dated by what I said, our AMS radiocarbon dating method. And then we have the PGNP, that is tuar dal, which is cultivated now, but it comes from Bastar area in central India. And then you have Hyacinth bean, that is avare. It is also introduced from Africa. And little later, we also get evidence for Hyacinth bean from Africa. And then you have the pearl millet, sajje, from Africa. And you have pigeon free from Orissa. And you have chicken coming up into this particular region by around 1900 to 1800 BC. They are introduced from North India, not local to southern India. And then we have indirect evidence of fiber crops, and this is called spindle hole kind of a thing. They have been found at a number of Neolithic sites in the region, and they suggest cotton spinning might have taken place. So fiber crops were already there. We have some oil seeds as well, sesame and so on. But these were the basic food crops and one economic crop, that is cotton, cultivated during the early phase of the Neolithic and so on. In addition to that, we see evidence for craft activity in terms of lithic production, large-scale stone axe manufacturing activity, pyrotechnology, where heat treatment of rocks was important to produce these beautiful beads that were made from chert, agate, jasper, cornelian, steatite, faience as well. And so textile, evidence of textile as well. And then you have copper reworking that we see, although there is no evidence of copper metallurgy, it gives us clues to the fact that copper was obtained directly from the geological formations and so on. And then you have iron working around 1000 BC. So metallurgy comes into picture. So the systematic documentation has helped to trace the stages in which technological and cultural evolution was taking place. In addition to that, we have abundant evidence of human burials, which are now we are trying to establish ancient DNA, potential of these sites and so on. But that is a different aspect. It is still ongoing. We don't have any affirmative on the humans themselves, but definitely they were gradually shifting from hunting gathering to agricultural way of life. So here the surplus production helps us to think in terms of evolution from a domestic economy to political economy, and the presence of megaliths also tell us that social hierarchy was also coming into existence. So there were, because when large-scale manufacturing takes place, you have to procure raw material, you have to transport raw material, you have to process raw material, and then ensure that they are systematically distributed. So this cannot be done by the person who makes these, whether it is pottery or a stone axe. So there is a class of people, elite, and the megaliths represent that these burials were meant for those who belong to elite or the upper echelon of the Neolithic, megalithic site and so on. So looking at the wild distribution of various basic food crops that we saw previously, their distribution is seen in terms of what we call Vigna radiata, the green gram and so on. And then you have wild moong dal coming from Western Ghats, and then you have this tur dal coming from Bastar area, and then in central India you have some of these Vigna radiata and so on. So tracing this is possible through what we call geophytology. So modern day herbarium samples help us, in terms of locating where they are even today seen in the wild, and they are also reflected in the archaeological context, helps us think in terms of, although they are not coming from the immediate neighborhood, they were brought in from distances, and that was possible because of movement of people in terms of pastoral movements, or also in terms of trade and exchange networks with the neighboring contemporary agricultural societies beyond southern India. So what we look at, the evidence is plant subsistence base across 3 cultural zones. What we see here in the foothills of Western Ghats, then the central part where we have Neolithic villages and ash mounds, and then the eastern part where we don't have ash mounds but full-fledged Neolithic sites, occupying not only hilltops but rock shelters and also caves. So cave Neolithic sites are very rare in India, but in this region we have those rock shelters and caves which were also inhabited by the Neolithic people, because relatively densely vegetated region is this Kadapa region, and they had access to wild food resources as well. So we are looking at this particular region as a potential area for discovering, in other words, identifying pre-3000 BC Neolithic transitions. And if that happens, we will be in a better position to trace the gradual transition from hunting gathering to early agriculture, where relatively wild morphology of these animals which were domesticated can be documented. So it gets So this is another map which gives you a broader picture of the early phase of Neolithic across the old world. So right from North Africa to other parts of the Indian subcontinent, to Southeast Asia, where very different, mangoes and then varieties of other fruit crops were brought through naval network through navigating, through sea links were already there in the Neolithic and so on. And then the Americas contributing to some of their native crops into the regions which were not familiar with those crops and so on. So this is a simple map. So we look at this movement from Southwest Asia into the Indian subcontinent, Balochistan Plateau, and then look at Gujarat, where the millets were first cultivated as early as 5,000, 4,000 BC. And then in central India, we have eastern and central India, we have rice province, and then we have millet province here. All of them developed independently. They did not initially influence the developments here. These people did not influence the developments here, whereas these people also did not influence here. The early phase of Neolithic was all independent of one another. But then when these culture systems were well established, long distance trade networks were established, so with the exchange of food crops and introduction. It's not only these crops were introduced into this area, these people also, distributed their native crops into other area. So not only at the receiving end, but also dispersing the local crops which were identified during the Neolithic time period were also dispersed into other parts of the Indian subcontinent. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Yeah.
ಆತ್ಮೀಯರೇ, ಇದುವರೆಗೆ ಬಳ್ಳಾರಿ ಸಂಗನಕುಲ್ಲು ನವಶಿಲಾಯುಗ ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ವ್ಯವಸಾಯದ ಕುರುಗಳು ಕುರಿತ ಒಂದು ವಿಶೇಷ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸವನ್ನು ತಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೇಳಿದ್ದೀರಿ. ಈ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟ ಹಾಗೆ ತಮಗೆ ಏನಾದರೂ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದ್ದರೆ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ತಾವು ಕೇಳ್ಬೋದು, ಸರ್ ಉತ್ತರಿಸ್ತಾರೆ.
Thank you, Dr. Kurishettar, for an lucid and eruditic presentation of the subject. I heard you once in my department in Geological Survey of India way back in 2008 or 9. I had arranged a talk by you on Sangankallu, but I was curious to know what has transpired between that time and now. It's very interesting. Now I am thinking of expanding this matter to mining in nearby areas.
Mining, yes.
Yeah, early hunter-gatherer to agriculture to mining. Because there are evidences of paleo mining in Vajrakurur area, Racharal area for diamonds actually, and also in some areas for copper. Okay, so whether we can expand it further, we will have to work on that. That's a different thing. But my questions are many, but important 2 or 3 questions I will ask. So one is Gaudur and Kakkeri, we have ash monts.
Right.
Oh, okay. And he mentioned about Toba ash layer.
Yep.
So these two are different.
Yes.
So I would like to know from you about Toba.
Yes.
And that's one question. Second question is your work in Billasurgam area. I entered that cave when I was looking for phosphate deposits in Kurnool Basin.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for your comments. As far as your first question was about mining transition from, as I said in my lecture, near Halkundi, between Bellary and Andhra border, there is a place called Halkundi. There are series of ash mounds, and in the neighborhood of ash mounds, way back in 1870s, Robert Brucefoot himself documented the presence of copper workings. Like if you go to Vandalli in Raichur near Hatti, you have gold workings there. So these have been dated to early historic period. Dr. Radhakrishna has a paper and all that. But here copper workings were very common, and this is the region where copper occurs in the metal form, not in the form of an ore. And it is small quantities. They did not have copper, that kind of copper resources like we have in the Indus province and so on. But they had access to this metal and they made use of them. Few artifacts occur, and that is where we think that their knowledge of metal was already there in the Neolithic period, but it is around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC or so. And then in the granitic area, we do not have very clear evidence of pre-Neolithic mean hunter-gatherers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherer evidence. Only recently I came across in the Sandur cyst belt 2 caves in the Navaluti area. I wanted to go there because these caves were mentioned by Food in his report. Wanted to go there for a long time because caves are more potential like Bilasargam and so on for obtaining in situ evidence of human activity there. So when we we went there, I said we have to look for microliths when we go to that particular cave in the Santur region. We were successful and we found microliths. And why we found was the cave floor deposit have now been dug out by the local people to establish a small shrine there. So the bottom sediments were thrown up and that contained microliths. So we have sent for dating and all that. There are some human remains as well as animal remains going through this process of dating and in identifying these bones in terms of human, animal and so on. That is one thing. We went back to Bilasargam because we were working on the problem of modern human expansion into the Indian subcontinent. In fact, Foot excavated there in 1880s and he went there because the caves were the ideal places to look for fossilized human remains and so on. So Huxley was interested in sending Foot to excavate Bilasargam. They were discovered by Newbold, as you may be knowing. So when he went there, he dug there, the trenches are still there. And then he could find some animal bones. And also he said that there are some suspected bone tools of the Magdalenian. So the idea was to look for human remains to build up the story of human evolution from primitive forms to evolved forms and so on. So Foot and his son, they excavated, they found a lot of animal remains. They were sent to Ledecker. He made a list of animals, identification, and published them and so on. Following that, only geological survey paleontologists were going. And in the 1960s, the problem was filling the gap in the Sonnet succession from lower, middle, upper, and Mesolithic. So we did not have typical Mesolithic, upper Paleolithic sites in India till the 1960s. Professor Sankali has sent 2 of his students to resurvey, revisit that area, and see if food identifications can be reconfirmed. Although they said they could find some upper Paleolithic, we were not convinced of them, but then again many more caves were explored, and then some test pittings were done. They only collected animal fauna. And even when we went there in the early part of the 21st century, we worked there for 5 years. We were armed with better methods, field methods, dating methods, and so on. And we know the history of paleontology of those caves, but we still wanted to find out whether we have human remains here. If not early Paleolithic human remains, at least modern human remains.
That is the best site for avian evolution.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Then when we reanalyzed all the stratigraphic, sequence of animal remains, and then interestingly, in one of the cave floors, we found microtephra, means that volcanic ash, glass shards, deposited into the cave floor deposit. Yes, that was the most exciting thing for us. And that gave us an age of 74,000 years. And then we have now OSL dating method, optically stimulated luminescence dating method. You don't require organic or material for dating. So the soil quartz particles can be dated directly by using that particular method. It is an extension of what we call thermoluminescence method. So here, OSL dates to the bottom of the excavated trenches took us back to 200,000 years. So now nearly 260,000 years, history of that particular cave occupation could be made. So all kinds of animal remains. Most interesting thing was the evidence of Theropithecus gelida, a old world monkey, which does not live in India today. It is only found in Ethiopian highlands. So that it was wrongly identified by earlier paleontologists. When it was re-examined, we found that it is this particular Theropithecus gelida and not living in India today. And then we said this tephra chronology, the glass shard fixing the chronology, OSL giving us a clear picture of the history of animal fauna living in that area, not in the cave itself, but in the neighboring area. And then they were deposited in the clay floor. We have not yet found clear evidence for Paleolithic or Mesolithic or even upper Paleolithic there. But we found rock art, we dated that rock art to 4,500 years ago. That is the Neolithic context. We do get in the upper level some pottery pieces and stray stone tools and so on. That is the story when it comes to revisiting, investigating the caves. We went in search of human remains, but we got this wonderful picture of, animal evolution and, uninterrupted sequence. Except one or two extinct animals, you have most of the grassland ecosystem adapted animals which were living there throughout the last 250,000 years or so. And then this Toba ash, there were, Toba caldera in Sumatra of Indonesia. There were major eruptions in the last 10 lakh years or so. The first one is called the oldest Toba tuff, and the middle Toba tuff, and the youngest Toba tuff. Youngest Toba tuff was of very high magnitude, to nearly 28,000 million tons of ash were thrown into the atmosphere, and the cloud was transported across the entire area, including western part of the Pacific, up to Lake Malawi in Kenya. So these glass shards are found in the lake beds in the Indian Ocean cores, like Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, and also Indian Ocean cores. So the NIOA people, National Institute of Oceanography people, also have been able to identify the presence of glass shards in the ocean cores obtained by them. And Dr. Pattan, you may be knowing, he has done that work, and he has been able to establish the age of the glass shards belonging to YTT and so on. So these YTT deposits were not known, although it was known to people as a whitish material. So many people thought it is diatomaceous bed. Somebody said it is calcareous bed. But we, in 1987, I was working in Maharashtra. I discovered the first evidence for well-preserved volcanic ash. And that actually led to the discovery of many more sites across the peninsula, right from Vindhyas in the north to eastern India, southern India, and so on. And this site of Jalapuram, where we have found this volcanic ash, was also our discovery. While we were working at Vilasargam, we also used to take transect surveys during weekends, and we went, because the name Jalapuram was very curious to me, I said, let us go and see what is there. And when we were approaching the site, we saw that ash clouds rising because it is being mined for a detergent industry. So I knew what volcanic ash looks like. It's a pure glass, and it turned out that we have the most well-preserved volcanic ash horizon in this ancient lake, which is now cut by the Jureru River. And there are sections, and in these sections, we not only see volcanic ash material, but then there is a stratigraphic presence of middle Paleolithic tools below the ash horizon as well as above the ash horizon. For the first time in Indian prehistory, middle Paleolithic was dated by absolute methods. So that was our contribution. And then it led to a debate across the world whether these middle Paleolithic people were modern humans, early modern humans who exited Africa much earlier than 60,000 years ago, or they exited Africa after 60,000 years ago with a different microlithic technology. So this debate is still going on.
What about Java man? Dispersal of the Java man?
Java man is, it is Solo River. It was the first discovery of Homo erectus way back in 1890s by Eugene Du Bois, a French anatomist living in that area. He discovered it. He called it Para-anthropos. It's nearly human form and so on. But that is Homo erectus sensu lato. It's called East Asian Homo erectus because at that time, Africa was not known to, to be rich with these kind of human fossils of the Pleistocene and even Pliocene and so on. So here, this was the first discovery, and when African Homo erectus were discovered, they are older than those found in Indonesia. Indonesian Homo erectus or Solo man is dated to 1.2 million years, whereas Homo erectus in Africa is about 2.2 million years. So that is the first human expansion associated with human Homo erectus around 2 million years ago, and we see these stone tools made by Homo erectus all over the old world, Europe, Asia, in South Asia like India and Southeast Asia and so on. So this is the story when it comes to understanding the importance of volcanic ash in quaternary deposits.
We have two more new discoveries in other places and near Gauribudnur. Near Gauribudnur, there's a new discovery of an ash layer.
Oh, really?
My colleague has brought to light.
Oh, excellent.
It
Ah.
has given 74%.
74, excellent. Where it has been published?
It is in JGS.
Oh, okay.
Technology Geological Society.
Society only?
And also our departmental
I like to have.
one Dr.
Ah.
Biren Singh
Oh.
from Jammu.
Oh.
When he was working here,
Uh-huh.
he got it
Wonderful.
near
Okay, okay. Of course, now many more sites in the eastern part of Kadapa Basin, in Sagileru Valley, and then we have in Paleru Basin and Maneru Basin. In all these east Kadapa Basin, number of sites with volcanic ash material, including archaeological material. Yep. They are all ash mounds, like we have at Kudutini or at Sangankallu. They were, pastoralism I did not, because focus was on agriculture. There are various explanations why, this is burnt cow dung, cattle dung, accumulated and set on fire episodically. And over each of these ash mounds have a life history of 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. And Kudutini is the largest ash mound so far, and the first ash mound that was discovered in southern India.
You mentioned about Ramapuram in your map.
Ha.
What is that?
It is a Neolithic site.
Is it near Madakalpuru or
No, it is in Karnool, Tungabhadra Valley. Yeah.
ಬೇರೆ ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದೆಯಾ?
Sir, can you just say currently what is the status? What kind of research is still going on, and what is the method you are adopting? Are you tracing back, and what are you looking at? Is it the tools? Is it the materials that were found at that time?
As far as material remains, like stone axes and pottery are concerned, we have understood them as much as possible in terms of the procuring raw material for making pottery, the processing the raw material for making pottery, and then we get into the fabric analysis. And if it is a pottery which was set on fire in a kiln, it can be directly dated by what we call thermoluminescence method. What is happening is many of the sites are getting lost. So I have made a list of iconic sites in the context of Karnataka and so on, and then they need to be revisited because we have new methods, because we have not understood the Neolithic archaeology as much as it is expected because of the methodologies available at our disposal. But the point is, very few states in India patronize archaeological research. That's the most unfortunate thing. And even when we want to do, even after having been retired, I retired in 2013 now, I'm still doing some field work and trying to collect systematic documentation, etc. But if I apply for permit or license to investigate, I will not get the license. If I want funding for research, I will not get funding. And that is one reason because of this museum, I have been able to sign MOU with IIT Gandhinagar, where there is an archaeological science center which is being developed, and they have allowed all of these scientists to come and take samples from my collection and go ahead with their modern research and so on. But this kind of approach is not undertaken by other archaeologists who have had excavated many other sites in southern India. So what is required, unlike in Tamil Nadu, you may have read in newspapers now and then, there's so much of support by the government of Tamil Nadu, but this is not seen here. So prehistory is a neglected part, and I don't know. That is why I said these kind of interactions, with enlightened people is always helpful to promoting archaeology, interest in archaeology and so on. So I used to tell whenever I address this kind of gathering, I say, as long as I was in service, I was doing archaeology for archaeologists because I wanted publications. I wanted high impact factor journals to accept our papers. And now I want to do archaeology for the public. It's not for archaeologists, but for the public. And it has been going on in the last 7-8 years. To generate interest among people is the most, important. It should be on our priority. It's not be just read in the newspapers and forgotten. Thank you.
So you mentioned there was large-scale manufacturing of stone axes there, and also the discovery of beads and material. So does that imply the sort of trade that was there, and what is the scope of trade that must be there? And so one more, if I may add.
Yeah.
Is there an assessment of the kind of population that this site would be supporting, and and the dispersal in the subsequent Chalcolithic period or something?
Yeah, as I mentioned already, when you generate surplus, it also implies trade is an important aspect of the economy. So surplus generation also gradually gives rise to what we call urbanization. So if you go into major books of early history of southern India, they say that urbanization in southern India is as late as 300 BC or so. But this evidence going back to 1300 BC gives us clear evidence that surplus production is the basic. Surplus food, winter cropping is important because the demography becomes stabilized. Then craftsmen, like I said, various types of crafts also develop, systematic expansion of the settlements. And you have this generated not for your own consumption. When you have surplus, you don't have granaries here to preserve the food after harvest and so on. So they have to be distributed. So the mechanism is to be understood. So trade only is possibility. So trades begin, and surplus also contribute to gradual development of urban economies. We have, unfortunately, now we do not have sites with monuments, of that time period, but they were living in simple huts and so on. They were all clusters. And in order to estimate, you need a number of sites which have been excavated horizontally. In a given site, how many houses were there? You have a circular house, you have a single-roomed house, you have a rectangular house, and so on. So on an average, if you have a good count of number of houses in a given site, on an average, you have 2 or 3 people in a house. So you can estimate the population. But it is not been possible here because the excavations were always small scale, and the sites were not subject to horizontal excavations. So that is one thing.
We see so many dolmens all over South India.
Sorry?
We see dolmens all
Yeah.
over South India and even near Bellary. and
yes,
other
we
places.
call,
Is there any connection between these two Neolithic
This
sites and
is,
dolmens?
as I said, wherever you have settlements with long duration, you have the emergence of the elite in the Iron Age. So these megaliths were constructed for those people who were in the top rung of the prehistoric society, because we still do not have a written language with the megalithic people here. So these megaliths are all over South India. They are of different types. That is why we call them complexes. In one burial complex, you have a dolmen, like the famous Hirebenkal site in Gangavati Taluk. Or you come to this place, our Sangankallu, you have stone circles. Sometimes you have a freestanding stone, which is called menhir. Then you have a dolmen, then a cyst burial like at Brahmagiri and so on. So there are multiple types of these burial monuments. So they are all over there, but they are interconnected through trade and exchange networks, definitely. But it's not the one and the same people. So they were confined to these geographical areas, resource-rich geographical areas, they flourished. So that is the kind of situation we see. Normally early archaeologists thought there were only burial sites. There were no habitation sites. But then we know very clearly, further documentation, re-examination of all these burial complexes, they read evidence of a village of that time period in the neighborhood. For example, Sangankallu, you see, it continued into Iron Age, and megaliths were built all around the site. So they are not isolated. Dolmens came little later. In the Neolithic, we have pit burials and also urn burials. Pots were made in order to enclose the dead remains of the dead person and bury. Sometimes terracotta coffins, like what we call sarcophagus. I have one excavated from Kudathini area, displayed in the Bellary Museum. Benkal is highly exaggerated site. It is a very potential site for detailed investigations. They can excavate the site, they can establish chronology, they can rebuild some of the fallen megaliths there. They are simply talking about the diverse variety and dense occurrence and things like that. They want it to be World Heritage Site. All this is not possible. There are efforts now going on. I told them, you cannot build a story. Who were the people living in the neighborhood of Hirebenkal? Please let us know first. There are deposits like at Brahmagiri, which can be excavated systematically. No, there are various sizes. Various sizes. They are there. Large ones are there, small ones also there. The size does not matter because it depends on the way you quarried the granitic slabs from the bedrock. Sorry? Hunsgi, we have, I said, 1.2 million year old lower Paleolithic site. Near Hunsgi, there is a site called Isampur, and that has been dated to 1.2 million years, like Athirampakkam 1.5 million years in Tamil Nadu.
ನಮ್ಮ ಗತದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾನವನಿಗಿರೋ ಕುತೂಹಲ ತುಂಬ ಅನಂತವಾದದ್ದು. ಇಂತಹ ಕುತೂಹಲ ಮತ್ತು ಜ್ಞಾನವನ್ನು ತಣಿಸುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಸಂಗನಕಲ್ಲು ಸೈಟ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಭಿನ್ನಶಾಸ್ತ್ರೀಯವಾದ ಬೆಂಬಲಗಳಿಂದ ನಮಗೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಜ್ಞಾನವನ್ನು ಸರ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಂತಹ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಇದ್ದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಮಹತ್ವವಾದ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳಿಲ್ಲಾಗಿದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ತುಂಬ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಭಾವಿಸ್ತೀವಿ. ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನು ನಡೆಸ್ಕೊಟ್ಟಂಥ ಸರ್ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಎಸ್ ವಿ ಮಂಜುನಾಥ್ ಅವರು ಒಂದು ಗೌರವ ಅರ್ಪಿಸಬೇಕಾಗಿ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ವಂದನೆಗಳು, ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದಿನ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ಅಕ್ಟೋಬರ್ 18ನೇ ತಾರೀಕು ಇದೇ ಸಭಾಂಗಣದಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆಯಲಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ. ಭಾರತೀಯ ತತ್ವಶಾಸ್ತ್ರಜ್ಞರಾದ ಆನಂದ್ ಕುಮಾರಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವಿಶೇಷ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಇದೆ. ಶ್ರೀಯುತ ಸೂರ್ಯಪ್ರಕಾಶ್ ಪಂಡಿತ್ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನು ನೆರವೇರಿಸಿಕೊಡಲಿಕ್ಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ.